Hi, I'm Dr. Mindy Maycant. I'm Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Lenore-Rhine University, where I'm also the Director of the Living Well Center for Vocation and Purpose. In the Living Well Center, we've begun a video series where we're asking the question, what makes for a life worth living? And we ask a variety of folks from different backgrounds to address the question from their perspective. And I'm grateful to have with me today Aneelah Afzali from Seattle, Washington. Aneela is a Muslim. She is an attorney. She serves as the executive director of the American Muslim Empowerment Network, which is at the Muslim Association of Puget Sound. Aneela works as an advocate for justice, for the rights for Muslim Americans, and to combat anti-Muslim bigotry. Aneela, it's really an honor to have you with me. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Mindy. It is an honor to be with you and have this conversation together.
Thank you. So to start, what would you say? What makes for a life worth living?
That's a big question. It's a lot that we can cram into that. But basically, I would say the finding passion and purpose in what you do. That's really, in my own journey, what I found to be that idea of sort of making life really meaningful for me every single day. For myself, my faith has been a large part of that, and finding purpose is a big component of why many people pursue faith in the first place. You introduced me as an attorney. I will say that I identify as a recovering attorney because I actually was an attorney and I practiced for about 10 years before I had a spiritual transformation that caused a big change in my life. And because of this spiritual transformation, I actually left my legal career to pursue service and knowledge, two things that my faith so strongly emphasizes, and two things that really help exemplify this idea of purpose in life. Knowing and recognizing that there is joy that we gain, there's happiness that we achieve, there is purpose that we achieve when we are doing what we think we are called to be doing. And in my own life, I was born Muslim, but I had kind of left the faith in a lot of ways. I had kind of stepped away from the faith, and it doesn't happen overnight. It happened through the course of several years where all of a sudden I looked back at my journey and realized, oh my God, 18 years later, I'm so far away from where I was initially. And for me, that spiritual transformation occurred when I actually read the Quran for the first time, cover to cover, and it actually shook me to my core. It moved my heart rather than just moving my mind, which is what I had the experience in college when I chose Islam for myself as my own faith tradition. But it was when my heart was moved that I created sort of this transformation occurred in me, and it resulted in me deciding to leave my legal career and pursue the kind of work that I'm doing now and really figure out what is my passion in life. Why are we here on earth? It's a question that we all ask. I know you're asking this of many other colleagues and speakers as well, but this idea of what are we doing here on earth? And finding that purpose for each of us and understanding how we can be mobilized in really powerful, effective ways to be change makers in the world, to be the forces for good, to be out there doing what we can every single day. That's what drives me. That's what gives me passion. That's what allows me, being on the front lines of justice advocacy work right now, especially at this moment where we are like living history in a profound and powerful way. That is just, that's meaning to me. That's what, compels me to wake up excited in the morning, even when I get very little sleep, which happens often, unfortunately. But it's really that. It's finding what you're passionate about, what gives you that sense of purpose. And sort of from my own faith perspective, it's combining sort of three different dimensions. One is that spiritual dimension. Another is the moral dimension that for me is connected to the spiritual dimension. And the third is the intellectual dimension. And these three pieces are so connected again to my own faith tradition. And it's why I personally find Islam the right faith for me. This idea of the intellectual, the seeking of knowledge, it's so emphasized throughout the Quran and in Islam itself. I mean, the idea of reflecting on life, reflecting on the world and learning and seeking knowledge, that idea, that concept appears in the Quran like over 750 times. And Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, emphasized that seeking knowledge is incumbent on every single individual. And it led my own life, my own pursuit of education and more. Then the idea of the spiritual, recognizing that connecting to God, identifying sort of what our path is to find that peace, that contentment in our own lives that really comes from connecting to God and to serving his creation, God's creation. And that connects to the moral dimension, which is really about being better people. This is similar to Jesus's teachings, peace be upon him, about the two greatest commandments, right? Loving God and loving your neighbor as yourself. A very same idea, and implementing it in our daily life in so many different ways.
Wow, thank you. That's a lot. What immediately jumps out at me as you're saying, as you were talking, is you mentioned service and intellectual endeavors or pursuit. I think you said pursuit, but the pursuit of knowledge. But it's the service part that stood out to me, because when I think of being an attorney, and so you said the spiritual awakening takes you away from that. What I imagine, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but what I imagine you perceived as a vocation when you took it, it wasn't just a job, it was something you felt in some way called to, and then you leave it, and it seems to me that both are careers or vocations of service. I mean, what you were doing as an attorney and what you're doing now. So it just seems that the focus on service has always been there. And yet you left what I at least, again, imagine to be a more financially stable service role as an attorney to then actively pursue fighting for, seeking, I don't know what the right word there would be, but justice, which might not be particularly lucrative and also probably isn't always particularly safe. And so that just strikes me as interesting, and your focus on service in that.
Yeah, absolutely. And the way that I would tie what I was doing before and now is that real strong commitment that I've always had in my life to justice, the commitment to justice. This is certainly a strong teaching in Islam, but it's also something that me, my own personality, had even as a kid growing up. I remember when I was in 7th grade, and my dad got a speeding ticket that I thought was unjust, and he thought it was also sort of racially biased. And I believed in this idea of our American values, and I stood strongly on that, this idea of fairness and equality and justice. And I told my dad, no, if it was racially biased, you should not be sort of taking that, you should not be paying that speeding ticket. And he was ready to just pay it and move on. And I said no, and I had him agree to not pay it. We showed up to court to challenge it. And I'm literally a 7th grader, a middle schooler, who at that time my dad's English was not so good. So I was speaking for him. And then I got up in court to represent him as a 7th grader. And then the judge looked at me and said, "Are you a lawyer?" And of course I said no. And he told me to sit back down. And that also sort of drove my passion to want to become a lawyer. But it's always been this commitment to justice. I questioned a lot of things that I saw unjust in the world, even as a kid. And there's a lot that I did in high school and college and law school that really sort of continued this pursuit of justice. So for me, it's always been about justice. But what I found is that I really had moved away from a lot of the other moral and sort of spiritual aspects of my faith tradition. I retained that commitment to justice, but where I found myself was in a place after having been sort of the first in my family to get to go to college. Law school was completely unheard of for me up until the point that I got into law school. Like I just couldn't even dream or imagine that as a reality, because people who looked like me, who came from my background, I didn't see many of them in law school. In fact, I didn't have anybody in my immediate family or my circle that I could turn to and see as an example of that. So even sort of doing that was trying to pursue justice in some ways. But at the end of the day, it boiled down to I was moving up the corporate ladder. At the time I left my legal career, I was general counsel of a healthcare IT company. Before that, I had made partner at a law firm. And all of these, as you mentioned, yes, absolutely lucrative. But what I realized is, oh my God, I'm pursuing money in a lot of ways as well. I'm pursuing that lucrative position, that title, that, that power. And what I was giving up was a lot more, because as I made it up this corporate ladder, I felt a sense of emptiness. I'm like, really, this is it? I made it to sort of the peak in certain senses of my legal career in certain positions, but there was a lot missing. And that sense of what was missing, the way I look at it is God allowed me to experience those material successes, let's say, in order to recognize a deeper ladder of success, a more meaningful ladder of success that I was able to recognize and say, I want to be doing something entirely different with my life. It's great to help healthcare IT company. It's great to help corporations or other organizations that need representation, legal representation, or help individuals even needing legal representation. But I really was called to do something entirely differently. And at the time, I'm also seeing, as I'm having this transformation, I'm seeing this misinformation campaign being spread in our country about Islam, about Muslims, and all of this like ugliness being promoted, this divisiveness in our country. And this is at the same time that I'm reading and learning more about Islam, and I'm personally experiencing the beauty, the joy, the peace, the positivity, the love, the mercy, compassion that it's bringing into my life and in my family's life. So this seems such at odds with the narrative that was being promoted, and I would say the lies that were being promulgated at a national level about Islam and Muslims. And that's where I recognize I need to do something. I cannot stay silent in this regard when this is happening. And in fact, there's a teaching of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, where he tells us that if you see some wrong, you have an obligation as a believer to do something to right the situation, to address the wrong. And if you can change it physically, like with your hands, stop an injustice from happening, do that. If you can't do that, at least speak out against it. Use your tongue, your voice, the power of your voice to do that. And if you can't even do that, then at least hate it in your heart. And the idea is to pray for some good to come out. And I thought, you know what, I'm in a position, even though it was risky, even though I didn't know what my future would hold, I realized this is my moment to take advantage of this and to make a difference directly, to be there on the front lines of creating change and building bridges and sort of creating the kind of connectedness that we're so desperately missing in life here on earth right now. In these times where we're so connected on social media and through the internet, we're also so disconnected from other human beings, from relationships, from God even. And that seemed like a more critical pursuit of justice for me. And that's why I realized this is what I need to be doing at this moment in time, at least. And I want to also add that this idea of pursuing happiness, which is promoted a lot. A lot of people talk about the pursuit of happiness. And I agree that that's an important consideration in our lives. But I think oftentimes people confuse pleasure with happiness. And I see our society oftentimes pursuing pleasure rather than happiness. And that pursuit of pleasure could in fact lead to our unhappiness in a lot of ways. If we're talking spiritually, if we're talking morally, even intellectually at times. So that was also happening. I'm seeing this and I'm like, you know what? I want to create the kind of change in the world that I believe in. I've been blessed with certain traits and skills and gifts that God has given me, and I really want to use those gifts toward the greater good to make a real difference in the best way I can.
Thanks. So what you make me want to ask next is, it sounds to me like you have a real connection between your sense of self, like your own understanding of who you are as a human being, as a Muslim woman in the US in this particular day and age, and your vocation. That they're of a piece, it seems to me. That sounds like a single story, kind of the who you are, and then the how your story is unfolding. I don't know if that rings true to you or not, but that's kind of how I hear you.
Absolutely. That is definitely true in my life. But one thing I say to a lot of people, especially younger people who hear my story and then think, hey, do I have to leave my legal career? Do I have to leave my other profession to make a difference or to do this? One thing I tell them is you actually don't. I felt for me, the right path was to leave my legal career and pursue something entirely different. And that was, in all honesty, the biggest leap of faith I've ever taken in my life. And the biggest risk in a lot of ways too, because I've done a lot of, high adrenaline activities, let's say. There's a lot of them that I've done and engaged in, but this was the biggest risk. But that's not the kind of path that everybody has to pursue. I think the important thing for each individual is to find out, what are you passionate about and what is your purpose in life? How are you fulfilling your purpose? What are you doing to really pursue that kind of purpose? And hopefully through that pursuit, it will also include helping other people or service in some way. Because at the end of the day, I believe that God created us as human beings in a certain way that we gain true happiness. We gain sort of that real sort of contentment when we're able to connect to God, that brings that peace to our heart, and serve other people, which brings that sense of happiness in our lives. That it's incredible how much joy we actually gain from helping other people and building those relationships where we're connected to other people, that's what makes our lives so meaningful, especially at a time of so much turmoil, so much trouble, so much difficulty. When we are able to focus on that, I think that brings us contentment, that brings us peace, that brings us happiness in a way that no material pleasures, that no sort of physical pleasures can do.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think if we were all able to do what you're suggesting, I agree with you that we are all created by God with particular gifts and callings, and that service to others is a critical part of that. And I mean, if we could just imagine how much different the world might look if we all took that to heart and all strove to discern what it is that we ourselves are most uniquely gifted to do for the sake of God and the world around us. It might make a pretty big difference.
Absolutely, I think it would. Yeah, there's no doubt in my mind about that. I also think that an important part of all of this is our perspective. Because so much of what we see in the world right now, for some people, is just negative. And you know, the constant news cycle and media and even social media that's constantly filling us with so much of this negativity actually has a real impact on us as individuals, as human beings. And I think it's so important for us to try, to the extent we can, to disconnect from that negativity at times. And I think that's, for me, why the 5 daily prayers in Islam is so important. It is a sort of, you know, moment of meditation, of sort of some physical, like yoga kind of exercise, because our movements are very physical, and also that ability to connect to God and put the world and its problems in perspective. You know, we bring our problems to God, and God helps resolve them for us, and then it takes away our stress and our worry and makes it easier for us to cope with life. And then also it brings a perspective, or it gives us the ability to hold this perspective that, you know, the cup is half full, that God is ultimately in control, that there is goodness, to focus on the goodness, you know, rather than the grass is greener, or, oh my God, so many problems. I'm not doubting any of those problems. And of course, there are so many serious problems that we can address as human beings. But the perspective I have on that is, look at all of these issues that I have the opportunity to work on. Look at all of these opportunities around us, because at the end of the day, this life, from my perspective as a Muslim, this life is a test. And the test is, what are we doing with the gifts we've been giving, including our time, our youth, our health, our wealth? What are we doing with that? And if we're using these gifts that we've been given in a positive way to make a difference, and our good deeds outweigh our bad deeds, then we actually, you know, gain admission with God's mercy to paradise. You know, that's a perspective I hold. And through that lens, if you look at it that way, all the problems, all the wrongs in society, imagine they're all like gold coins around you that you can accumulate all these good deeds. You know, if there's only, let's say, a tiny, tiny portion of wrongs in the world, or injustices, or people in need of assistance, then it would be a harder competition for all of us to achieve the kind of good deeds, or you know, accumulate the good deeds that we need as part of this test of life. The fact that we're inundated with it should actually be seen as an opportunity for us to do good, to help others, and in doing so, we're actually helping ourselves. That's the secret, you know, to happiness in a lot of ways, is once we realize that by helping others, we're actually helping ourselves and fulfilling ourselves. That's when I think we gain some of that you know, the joy and happiness that many of us oftentimes are pursuing without understanding how to achieve it, or without ever really achieving it, because we're often distracted by pleasure rather than happiness. And having that connection, you know, working on that relationship and that connection with God, that's what brings the kind of inner peace to me. and it's a struggle. I'm not always there. I fall off many times. My spirituality goes up and down and up and down. But the idea that I'm in that struggle with God, that I'm not alone, that I'm constantly surrounded by loving care and compassion and mercy, and that at the end of the day, I have an ability to turn to a source far greater than me, puts everything in perspective and allows me to maintain the sense of humility that I think is so desperately missing as well in a lot of ways in our current world, and to really understand the differences between creation and the creator.
Thank you. Do good and help others. That is a perfect place to end. Thank you so very much for taking the time to join me today and for sharing.
Thank you for having.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me, and thank you to all for listening to my words. Hopefully they're helpful in some ways.
They are very much. Thank you very much.